Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles gently and long thoughts are allowed to slow down. This is a quiet place for ideas that stretch across centuries, for stories that move carefully, and for nights when the mind wants something steady to follow while the rest of the world softens. Tonight, we're exploring a possibility that sits just beneath the surface of many ancient stories and modern structures, an idea that never quite disappears no matter how much time passes. The idea that the Anunnaki, the figures described in the earliest written records of civilization, may not be relics of a distant past at all, but participants in a system that never truly ended. The topic does not require urgency, excitement, or spectacle. It asks for patience. It asks for careful listening. It asks for a willingness to consider continuity instead of collapse, inheritance instead of disappearance. The suggestion is not that beings descended from the sky still walk openly among us, issuing commands or demanding offerings. The suggestion is quieter, more subtle, and perhaps more unsettling. That control does not need visibility. That influence does not require presence. That systems, once established deeply enough, can continue long after their architects step back from view. Civilizations often imagine control as something loud: armies, thrones, crowns, public declarations. But history repeatedly shows that the most durable forms of power are the ones that feel natural, unquestioned, and permanent. Laws that seem inevitable. Hierarchies that feel self-evident. Structures so old that no one remembers choosing them. When ancient texts describe the Anunnaki as lawgivers, planners, and designers of order, they are not describing temporary rulers. They are describing architects. This story begins long before modern governments, before nations, before currencies, before even the idea of recorded history as we understand it. It begins in a world where survival depended on the rhythm of rivers, where cities were fragile and where knowledge itself was power in its rawest form. The Sumerian tablets do not portray the Anunnaki as distant gods concerned only with ritual. They are administrators, judges, organizers. They assign roles. They define labor. They establish kingship not as a human invention, but as a system handed down. Once something is framed as divine order, it becomes difficult to question. That framing may be one of the most important technologies ever introduced to humanity. A population that believes authority originates beyond itself will rarely attempt to dismantle it. Instead, it will focus on maintaining alignment with it. Over time, the source fades, but the structure remains. If such a system were designed to endure, disappearance would not be a failure. It would be a success. True control does not require constant correction. It requires initial conditions that naturally reinforce themselves. Economic dependency, legal hierarchy, centralized authority, inherited status. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient patterns. As societies grew more complex, direct oversight would have become unnecessary. Once humans learned to police themselves within established frameworks, once ambition aligned with obedience, the system could run quietly. The most efficient ruler is the one who does not need to issue orders, because the population already understands how to behave. Over thousands of years, names change. Symbols change. Gods become myths. Myths become metaphors. But the underlying mechanics remain surprisingly stable. Power concentrates. Resources flow upward. Labor flows downward. Narratives justify the arrangement. Those narratives evolve with the culture, taking on new language, new values, new explanations. What once was framed as divine command becomes natural law, economic necessity, national security, or progress. The idea explored here is not that modern institutions are secretly run by ancient beings in physical form, but that the framework attributed to the Anunnaki may still be operating because it was never dismantled. It was inherited, adjusted, normalized, passed from empire to empire like a tool too useful to abandon. History often celebrates revolutions as moments of transformation, but most revolutions replace faces, not foundations. Kings fall, systems remain, flags change, hierarchies persist. Even when power appears to shift, it often settles back into familiar patterns. Centralization, bureaucracy, distance between decision-makers and those affected by decisions. If the Anunnaki established the earliest models of governance, resource extraction, and social order, then their influence would not require presence today. It would exist in default assumptions, in the way authority is defined, in the way labour is valued, in the way obedience is rewarded and dissent is contained. This perspective reframes the question of control. Instead of asking who is in charge now, it asks who designed the rules that decide what being in charge even means. It looks past personalities and institutions and focuses on architecture. Systems are more durable than rulers. Ideas outlive their originators. The persistence of certain myths may be less about belief and more about memory. Stories survive when they resonate with lived experience. When patterns repeat, old narratives feel relevant again. The Anunnaki stories describe beings who shaped humanity not through destruction, but through instruction. They taught order. They introduced hierarchy. They organized chaos into productivity. Modern civilization still runs on those principles. Efficiency, compliance, optimization, growth. These values are rarely questioned because they are framed as neutral or inevitable, yet they reflect a specific worldview, one that prioritizes control through structure rather than force. There is also the matter of distance. Ancient rulers were often physically removed from those they governed. Palaces, temples, sacred spaces, separation reinforced authority. Today, decision-makers are often equally distant, separated by layers of abstraction. Algorithms, committees, markets, policies. The distance remains, even if the symbols have changed. Technology has not dismantled control. It has refined it. Surveillance no longer requires watchtowers. Compliance no longer requires visible punishment. Participation is voluntary, encouraged, incentivized. People carry the system with them. They maintain it. They defend it. They optimize themselves for it. This continuity does not require conspiracy. It requires momentum. Systems, once embedded deeply enough, resist change because changing them would require questioning assumptions that feel foundational. Who deserves power? What progress means? Why inequality exists? These questions are often treated as impractical or naive. The Anunnaki, as described in ancient texts, were not creators in the sense of spontaneous origin. They were modifiers, shapers. They worked with existing materials, existing beings. They altered conditions. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, that role matters. Modification implies intention. Design implies foresight. If control today feels impersonal, automatic and unavoidable, that does not mean it lacks origin. It may mean the origin succeeded. The most stable systems are the ones people stop noticing. As this exploration continues, the focus will not be on spectacle or fear. It will remain grounded in history, patterns, and continuity. The goal is not to convince, but to observe, to notice repetitions, to trace lines from the earliest written laws to the present day. Nothing here requires belief in hidden rulers watching from shadows. It only requires acknowledging that power structures rarely emerge spontaneously. They are built, refined, inherited, and once established they tend to persist until something disrupts them at a foundational level. The story moves forward by examining how those foundations were laid, how they evolved, and why they remain familiar even after thousands of years. There is no sharp boundary between past and present here, only a long, steady extension. And as this line of thought settles in, the narration continues gently onward, not toward an ending, but deeper into the structure itself, where origins become habits, and habits quietly become the shape of the world. Long before authority was written down, before power was formalized into titles, borders, or offices, it existed as something instinctive and uneven. Early human groups understood strength, leadership, and survival, but these ideas were fluid. Influence shifted with circumstance. A skilled hunter led during the hunt. An elder spoke when memory mattered. A healer guided when illness arrived. Power was situational, temporary, and personal. It had no permanent name, no inherited shape, no guarantee of continuation. The world in which the Anunnaki entered human memory was not one of rigid hierarchy. It was one of vulnerability. Floods erased settlements, droughts emptied granaries, night carried danger. The sky itself was unpredictable, bringing storms, fire, and long periods of silence. Survival depended on understanding patterns that humans could observe but not control. The movements of stars, the swelling of rivers, the return of seasons. Knowledge of these rhythms was rare and valuable. The earliest traces of the Anunnaki appear not as distant deities in a fully formed pantheon, but as figures associated with instruction, measurement, and order. In the oldest Sumerian tablets, they are not described as creators of the universe, but as organizers within it. They arrive into a world already populated, already struggling, already capable, but lacking coordination on a large scale. Their significance lies not in brute force, but in the introduction of systems. Writing itself emerges alongside these figures. That timing matters. Before writing, memory was communal and unstable. Stories changed, rules shifted, authority relied on presence. Once marks could be pressed into clay, something changed permanently. Decisions could outlast decision-makers, instructions could travel, ownership could be recorded, obligation could be enforced across time. The Anunnaki are consistently linked to this transition. They appear in administrative contexts, assigning duties, establishing roles, measuring land, defining labour. They are associated with the me, the divine decrees or laws that govern civilization. These were not vague moral suggestions. They were specific. Kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, warfare, agriculture, all were structured, categorized, and regulated. This was power before it had a modern name, but it was already recognizable. It was centralized. It flowed downward. It was justified by origin rather than consent. The Anunnaki did not rule by negotiation. They ruled by definition. They decided what things were for, who did what, and how value was determined. The concept of kingship itself is described as descending from the Anunnaki. In the Sumerian king list, rule is not claimed by humans, it is granted. Kingship descends from heaven. This framing is crucial. It removes authority from the realm of debate. If power originates beyond humanity, then humans can administer it but not challenge it. This marks a profound shift in how societies understood leadership. Before, authority emerged from capability and circumstance. After, it became institutional, inherited, protected by ritual and myth. A king did not need to prove strength daily. His legitimacy was assumed because it was anchored to a divine past. The Anunnaki in these accounts do not micromanage daily life. They establish the framework and step back. That withdrawal is often interpreted as disappearance, but it can also be understood as completion. Once the structure is in place, enforcement can be delegated. Temples become centers of both worship and administration. Priests act as intermediaries. Grain is stored, distributed, taxed. Labor is organized. Time itself is regulated through calendars tied to celestial observation. The sky becomes a clock. The gods become timekeepers. What is striking is how quickly this model spreads and stabilizes. Cities grow, surpluses increase, hierarchies solidify, inequality becomes normalized. Some are born into authority, others into obligation. This division is no longer temporary, it is encoded. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as benevolent caretakers or cruel tyrants. They are planners. Their concern is order, stability, continuity. Chaos threatens productivity. Productivity sustains civilization. Civilization sustains the system. Human memory preserves this relationship carefully. Myths describe debates among the Anunnaki about labour. At times, humans are created or modified to relieve the gods of work. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the message is consistent. Human effort is organised to serve a larger structure. These stories are not unique to Sumer. Similar patterns appear across early civilizations. Gods who teach agriculture, gods who establish law, gods who appoint rulers. The names change, the functions remain. What emerges is a shared memory of transition, a time when life shifted from small, flexible groups to large, rigid societies, from adaptation to administration, from survival to production. Power, in this context, is no longer personal. It becomes abstract. It exists in roles, offices, systems. A person can be replaced. The structure remains. This abstraction is one of the most significant developments in human history. It allows civilizations to persist beyond individual lifetimes. It also allows power to operate without direct accountability. Once authority is tied to tradition, ritual, and divine origin, it resists challenge. The Anunnaki stories preserve the moment when this shift occurred. They remember a time when power had to be explained because it was new. Before people accepted hierarchy as natural, it had to be justified. The justification chosen was cosmic. Over generations, the explanation became unnecessary. Children were born into systems they did not question. The origin faded into myth. The structure remained as reality. This is how memory works at scale. Details erode. Patterns persist. The earliest laws attributed to divine sources emphasize obedience, order, and consequence. Justice is not framed as fairness, but as balance. Disruption is punished not because it is immoral, but because it threatens stability. This logic continues through empires: Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Rome. Each inherits and adapts the model. Each claims legitimacy through continuity with a sacred past. Even when gods are renamed or replaced, the structure remains recognizable. By the time writing spreads widely, the idea that authority is constructed rather than given is almost unthinkable. Power feels ancient because it is ancient. It feels inevitable because it has always been there within living memory. The Anunnaki occupy a unique position in this story because they appear at the threshold. They are remembered as arriving into a world without fixed hierarchy and leaving behind one that could not imagine life without it. Whether they are interpreted as literal beings, symbolic representations of early elites, or mythologized memories of an unknown influence, their role is consistent. They are associated with the birth of structured power. From this point forward, control does not require constant presence. It is embedded. It is taught. It is normalized. People enforce it themselves because it defines reality. This is why the question of whether the Anunnaki still control the world does not hinge on their physical existence. Control, once established at the level of assumption, no longer needs a controller. The story continues not by looking for gods in the sky, but by tracing how their systems settled into human behaviour, how obedience became virtue, how hierarchy became order, how inequality became tradition. The transition from memory to inheritance is gradual, quiet, and almost invisible. That is its strength. As societies grew more complex, the original figures receded further into the background. They became ancestors, symbols, names carved into stone. Their direct involvement faded, but their frameworks expanded. The moment before power had names was brief. Once named, power learned how to persist. And from that persistence, the next layer of the story unfolds, where authority no longer needs divine faces, only human ones trained to preserve the pattern that began when the Anunnaki first stepped into human memory. Authority did not arrive as a concept fully formed. It had to be taught, reinforced, and made familiar long before it could feel natural. After the initial frameworks attributed to the Anunnaki were established, the next transformation was subtler but even more consequential. Power needed intermediaries. It needed visible human figures who could embody an invisible source. This is where gods, kings, and chains of command began to merge into a single, reinforcing system. In the earliest large settlements, direct contact with whatever figures were remembered as Anunnaki was no longer part of daily life. Yet the system they introduced could not function without ongoing administration. Crops had to be managed, labour had to be assigned, disputes had to be settled, resources had to be stored and redistributed. For this to work consistently, authority needed a human face, someone present, someone reachable, someone capable of enforcing rules without constantly explaining their origin. This is where kingship emerges not as leadership, but as representation. Early kings were not portrayed as autonomous rulers, they were stewards, appointed figures. The language used in ancient inscriptions is careful. Kings rule on behalf of the gods. They execute divine will. They are not the source of law, but its instrument. This distinction matters. A leader who claims personal authority can be challenged personally. A ruler who claims divine backing cannot. Disobedience becomes more than rebellion. It becomes disorder, sacrilege, a threat not just to the ruler but to the balance of the world itself. Chains of command begin here. Authority flows downward in a deliberate layered structure. At the top sit the gods, distant and unquestionable. Beneath them, kings. Beneath kings, priests and administrators. Beneath them, scribes, overseers, foremen. Each level enforces the will of the one above while being constrained by it. Responsibility is distributed, but accountability is diffuse. This structure is efficient. It allows control to scale. A single source of authority can influence thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions, without direct intervention. Orders are relayed, expectations are standardized, punishment is delegated. The Anunnaki narratives emphasize this hierarchy repeatedly. They do not depict a flat divine society interacting equally with humans. They depict councils, ranks, domains of responsibility. Even among the gods, authority is structured. Decisions are debated, decrees issued, roles assigned. Human society mirrors this pattern. Hierarchy becomes not only practical but sacred. To question it is to question the natural order. Priests play a crucial role in this transition. They are interpreters, translators of divine intent. They manage rituals, calendars, omens, and records. Control over knowledge gives them power that does not rely on physical force. They define what the gods want, when the gods are pleased, and how balance can be restored when it is broken. This places them in a unique position. Kings may command armies, but priests command meaning. They frame success and failure. A good harvest is divine favour. A drought is punishment. War is justified. Defeat is explained. In every case, the system remains intact. The chain of command is reinforced through repetition. Rituals, festivals, public ceremonies. These are not merely religious expressions. They are demonstrations of order. Everyone knows where to stand, who speaks, who listens, who obeys. Over time, children are born into this structure. They do not experience the transition from freedom to hierarchy. They experience hierarchy as reality itself. Authority feels as natural as gravity. Language adapts to support this. Titles emerge. Honorifics. Formal speech. The very way people address one another encodes status. Even posture, clothing and proximity become regulated. Power is visible everywhere, but rarely questioned. What is especially effective about this system is that it aligns personal ambition with obedience. Advancement requires loyalty. Favour flows downward. To rise within the hierarchy, one must accept it. This turns potential challengers into enforcers. The Anunnaki stories often describe humans as created or organized to serve specific functions. Whether literal or symbolic, the implication is clear. Purpose is assigned, not chosen. Fulfillment comes from proper placement within the system. This idea persists long after the gods themselves fade into abstraction. Work becomes duty. Duty becomes virtue. Virtue becomes identity. As writing spreads, authority becomes increasingly abstract. Laws are recorded, contracts enforced, property defined. Power no longer needs to be present to act. A tablet carries authority across space and time. A seal validates orders from afar. This abstraction further distances power from accountability. A decision may originate far from its consequences. Responsibility becomes fragmented. Each individual follows orders. No one feels fully responsible for the outcome. This pattern is not accidental. It is structurally reinforced. Chains of command protect those at the top from direct consequence, while binding those below to compliance. Military organization adopts the same logic. Orders flow downward. Obedience is rewarded. Disobedience is punished. Soldiers are taught to trust the structure rather than their own judgment. Survival depends on it. Civil administration mirrors military discipline. Bureaucracy emerges as a technology of control. Records, quotas, censuses and taxes allow populations to be managed as resources rather than communities. At every stage, authority is framed as necessary. Without it, chaos. Without hierarchy, collapse. This framing is reinforced by selective memory. Periods of instability are emphasized. Order is celebrated. The Anunnaki narratives contribute to this framing by associating order with divine presence and chaos with absence. When the gods withdraw, disasters follow. When they intervene, balance is restored. This teaches a powerful lesson. Authority prevents suffering. Disobedience invites it. Over generations, the original source of authority becomes less important than the habit of authority itself. Even when gods are replaced by new gods, or one god replaces many, the structure remains. Monotheism does not eliminate hierarchy. It concentrates it. Kings become emperors. Emperors become representatives of a single supreme deity. Later, divine right becomes national destiny, legal mandate, economic necessity. The language changes. The chain of command persists. What began as instruction becomes expectation. What began as enforcement becomes culture. Authority is no longer something imposed from outside. It is internalized. People learn to police themselves. Shame replaces force. Fear becomes anticipation rather than reaction. Control becomes psychological. This is one of the most significant achievements of early hierarchical systems. They reduce the cost of enforcement by embedding compliance into identity. A good person obeys. A bad person disrupts. Once this association is established, dissent becomes deviance. It is not merely disagreement, it is wrongness. The Anunnaki are remembered not as tyrants but as teachers. This framing matters. Teachers shape thought. They define what is normal. They establish baselines. By teaching humanity how authority works, they ensured its continuation. A lesson once learned is difficult to unlearn, especially when it is reinforced by survival. As cities grow into empires, chains of command extend across vast distances. Local rulers answer to regional authorities. Regional authorities answer to central power. Messages travel. Orders flow. The system adapts but does not dissolve. Even collapse does not eliminate it. When empires fall, successor states adopt their structures. Roads are reused. Laws adapted. Titles inherited. Authority outlives regimes. The Anunnaki disappear from direct memory, but the logic they introduced remains active. Authority is assumed to be necessary. Hierarchy assumed to be natural. Obedience assumed to be virtuous. This teaching does not require ongoing belief in gods. It requires only continuity. Children raised within a hierarchy do not experience it as imposed. They experience it as given. And so, the lesson of authority spreads far beyond its origin. It becomes embedded in institutions, customs, and expectations. It shapes how people think about leadership, responsibility, and order. By the time modern systems emerge, the foundation is ancient. Governments, corporations, religions, and militaries all rely on the same basic structure. Chains of command, delegated authority, abstract justification. The gods no longer need to be named. The lesson has already been learned, and as this structure settles deeper into human civilization, the story moves forward into the long era where authority no longer announces itself as divine, but continues to operate with the same quiet certainty, shaping lives through systems that feel permanent, impersonal, and unquestionable. At some point in the long unfolding of human history, the Anunnaki appear to leave. The tablets grow quieter, direct references thin out, names that once dominated administrative hymns and mythic records begin to recede into genealogy, ritual, and legend. To later readers, it looks like a withdrawal, a departure, a closing chapter. But disappearance, especially in historical systems of power, is rarely absolute. More often, it is a change in visibility. The Anunnaki do not vanish in a dramatic moment. There is no final farewell recorded in clay, no universal collapse of their authority. Instead, what occurs is a gradual fading from the foreground of daily life, accompanied by the solidification of the structures they introduced. Their absence is subtle because their work is already done. By the time later Mesopotamian civilizations rise, the systems attributed to the Anunnaki are no longer new. Kingship is established. Law codes exist. Temples function as economic centers. Calendars regulate labor. Bureaucracies manage surplus. These mechanisms no longer require divine supervision to operate. They are self-sustaining. This is the hallmark of successful design. A system that continues to function without its designers present has achieved stability. It no longer needs explanation. It simply is. In mythic language, the Anunnaki retreat to the heavens. In practical terms, authority shifts fully into human hands, but within parameters already defined. Humans govern, but they govern according to inherited rules. The source of those rules becomes less relevant than their enforcement. This transition is remembered not as loss, but as normality. Generations are born into the system. They do not experience the absence as a change. They experience continuity. Later myths reinterpret the Anunnaki as ancestors, judges, or distant overseers. Their active role diminishes, but their legitimacy remains embedded in tradition. Kings still claim descent or appointment from divine origins. Priests still invoke ancient authority. Laws still reference sacred precedent. In this way, the disappearance becomes functional rather than literal. The figures no longer need to intervene because intervention is no longer required. One of the most revealing aspects of this period is how little changes structurally after the supposed departure. Empires rise and fall, but hierarchy persists. New gods replace old ones, but governance remains centralized. Even revolutions tend to preserve administrative frameworks while altering symbols. This suggests that the Anunnaki, whether historical, symbolic, or mythologized, were never meant to be permanent rulers in the visible sense. Their role was foundational. They introduced patterns that could outlast them. Power that depends on presence is fragile. Power that depends on habit is durable. The disappearance is also preserved psychologically. When authority becomes impersonal, it feels inevitable. People stop associating rules with rulers. Laws feel abstract. Systems feel natural. This detachment reduces resistance. It is easier to oppose a tyrant than a process. As divine figures retreat into myth, Control migrates into institutions. Temples become state offices. Ritual becomes protocol. Offerings become taxes. Sacred obligation becomes civic duty. Language evolves to support this shift. Terms that once referenced gods now reference law, order, or tradition. What was once obedience to the divine becomes obedience to the state, the market, or the collective good. The Anunnaki are remembered as having stepped back, but their logic steps forward. This pattern repeats across cultures. Egyptian gods fade into dynastic ritual. Greek gods become philosophical metaphors. Roman divine authority transforms into imperial law. In each case, the supernatural retreats while the structure remains. The disappearance also serves a narrative purpose. A distant origin lends legitimacy without inviting interference. If the source of authority is ancient and unreachable, it cannot be negotiated with. It cannot be appealed to directly. This makes the system more rigid, not less. Distance protects power. There is also a practical dimension. As societies grow more complex, centralized divine rule becomes inefficient. Delegation is necessary. Humans become managers of the system, but only within inherited constraints. The Anunnaki narratives often describe internal conflict among the gods, disagreements, fatigue, withdrawal. These can be read as mythic explanations for a transition from direct oversight to autonomous operation. The gods step back because the system no longer needs them. In this reading, disappearance is not abandonment. It is graduation. Humanity is left to run the machinery, but not to redesign it. This has important implications. If control today feels diffuse, automated, and difficult to trace, that is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of maturation. The more advanced a system becomes, the less visible its control mechanisms need to be. Modern systems operate similarly. Algorithms decide outcomes without revealing their creators. Policies persist beyond administrations. Economic structures influence lives without requiring personal command. The Anunnaki disappear in name, but their method becomes universal. This long disappearance also protects the narrative from scrutiny. When origins are distant, they become unquestionable. Tradition gains authority simply by surviving. Longevity is mistaken for legitimacy. Few stop to ask why things are arranged as they are. Fewer still trace those arrangements back to their earliest formulations. Time obscures intention. By the time writing becomes widespread and history becomes reflective rather than mythic, the Anunnaki are already legends. Their systems, however, are everyday reality. This separation is crucial. It allows societies to abandon belief in gods without abandoning obedience. Authority no longer needs myth to function. It only needs precedent. The disappearance is therefore incomplete by design. The figures fade, but the framework remains active. The hand withdraws, but the imprint stays. When people later look for signs of continued control, they often look in the wrong place. They search for beings rather than patterns, for rulers rather than rules, for faces rather than foundations. But control does not require overseers if oversight has been internalized. The long disappearance is not a gap. It is a transition from visible authority to structural authority, from command to conditioning. Even resistance movements often operate within the same frameworks. They seek representation within existing systems rather than questioning the systems themselves. This is not failure, it is inheritance. The Anunnaki, as remembered, did not need to remain present. Their success depended on their absence. Only by stepping back could their structures become unquestioned. This is why the disappearance never quite happens. The names fade, the stories soften, the gods retreat. But the architecture persists, shaping behaviour long after belief has changed. As the story moves forward, the focus shifts from divine memory to human operation, from gods to institutions, from origin to inertia. What follows is not a search for lost beings, but an examination of how control adapts when it no longer needs a name, only a function. As the visible symbols of divine authority faded, something more durable took their place. Control no longer needed thrones raised above the crowd or temples dominating city centres. Those were useful when authority had to be demonstrated. Once authority had been accepted, demonstration became unnecessary. What replaced it was quieter, more efficient, and far harder to challenge. When power no longer announces itself, it begins to feel like the natural shape of the world. The transition away from overt rule marks a critical stage in the long continuity of control attributed to the Anunnaki legacy. Authority moves from places you can point to into processes you participate in. Instead of commands delivered from above, expectations are embedded into daily life. Instead of rulers demanding obedience, systems reward compliance and punish deviation automatically. This is control without spectacle. In early civilizations, power had to be seen. A king on a throne, a god in a temple, a ritual in the open square. These displays were necessary because hierarchy was still fragile. It needed reinforcement. People needed reminders. Over time, those reminders became redundant. Once hierarchy became internalized, it could operate invisibly. The most effective form of control is the one that does not feel like control at all. As institutions matured, authority relocated into abstract structures. Law codes replaced royal decrees, bureaucracy replaced personal command, currency replaced tribute. These innovations made power portable, scalable, detached from individuals. A written law does not argue. A procedure does not negotiate. A system does not explain itself. This shift creates a new relationship between people and power. Instead of interacting with rulers, people interact with rules. Instead of confronting authority, they navigate it. Compliance becomes a matter of habit rather than belief. The Anunnaki stories emphasize order above all else. Once order is established deeply enough, it no longer requires guardians. It maintains itself through feedback loops, incentives, consequences, social pressure. Control becomes distributed. No single person appears responsible. Everyone enforces the system simply by participating in it. This diffusion is crucial. When power is centralized and visible, it can be resisted. When power is embedded and impersonal, resistance becomes difficult to define. There is no throne to overthrow, no temple to dismantle, only processes that continue regardless of who is in charge. Modern governance inherits this logic directly. Authority is exercised through regulations, policies, standards, and metrics. Decisions are justified as necessary, rational, or unavoidable. Responsibility is fragmented across committees, departments, and protocols. This fragmentation protects the system. No one feels fully accountable. Everyone is following procedure. The same pattern applies to economic systems. Control over resources no longer requires physical force. It requires access, permission, compliance with rules that determine who may participate and how. Markets regulate behavior more effectively than armies ever did. People adapt themselves to the system because survival depends on it. They learn its language, its expectations, its rhythms. They optimize their behavior to succeed within it. This adaptation is not coerced. It is incentivized. The disappearance of thrones does not signal freedom. It signals refinement. Power no longer needs symbols because it has become structural. Even belief is no longer required. A person does not need to believe in a system to be governed by it. Participation is enough. Paying taxes, using currency, obeying laws, following schedules. These actions reinforce the system regardless of personal conviction. Temples once centralized economic and social life, grain storage, redistribution, record-keeping. Modern equivalents exist everywhere, but they are not labeled sacred. Banks, databases, administrative centers, digital platforms. Their authority is technical rather than divine, but the effect is similar. Access is granted or denied. Resources are allocated. Behavior is tracked. What changes is not the function, but the justification. Where ancient systems invoked divine will, modern systems invoke efficiency, security, or progress. These concepts carry moral weight without requiring worship. They discourage questioning by framing outcomes as inevitable. This framing is powerful. If something is necessary, opposing it feels irresponsible. If something is efficient, resisting it feels irrational. If something is progress, rejecting it feels backward. Control thrives in this environment because it presents itself as neutral. The Anunnaki, as remembered, were not emotional rulers. They were administrators. Their authority was not personal, it was systemic. This makes their legacy particularly compatible with modern forms of governance. The system does not care who you are. It only cares whether you comply. Social norms play a critical role in maintaining this structure. Behavior is regulated not only by law but by expectation. People learn what is acceptable long before enforcement is necessary. Deviance is corrected socially before it reaches institutional response. This reduces the cost of control. Policing becomes minimal. Surveillance becomes passive. Most regulation is self-imposed. People internalize the system's values and reproduce them voluntarily. Success is defined by alignment, failure by deviation. Education systems reinforce this from an early age. Schedules, rules, evaluation, hierarchy. Children are trained to function within structured environments long before they encounter formal authority. Obedience is framed as cooperation, compliance as maturity. By adulthood, the system feels familiar, comfortable, safe. This familiarity makes alternatives feel threatening. Even when systems cause harm, people often defend them because they cannot imagine functioning outside them. Stability is mistaken for justice. The disappearance of temples also removes a focal point for dissent. Sacred spaces once concentrated power and opposition. When power is everywhere, opposition is nowhere. Modern control operates through abstraction. Data replaces observation. Algorithms replace judgment. Metrics replace understanding. Decisions are justified by numbers that appear objective but reflect embedded values. These values are rarely examined because they are hidden beneath layers of technical language. This is not accidental. Complexity protects authority. The harder a system is to understand, the harder it is to challenge. Expertise becomes a gatekeeper. Those who question are dismissed as uninformed. The Anunnaki myths emphasize knowledge as power. Those who understand the system govern it. Those who do not serve it. This division persists. Access to knowledge determines influence. Influence determines outcomes. The disappearance of visible rulers does not eliminate hierarchy. It conceals it. Even rebellion is often absorbed by the system. Dissent becomes commodified. Resistance becomes branding. Critique becomes content. The system adapts by incorporating challenges rather than confronting them. This adaptability is a sign of strength. Control without thrones or temples is resilient because it does not depend on loyalty to individuals or belief in myths. It depends on participation in routines. People wake up, work, consume, pay, repeat. The system does not need to be loved. It only needs to be used. This is why the idea that the Anunnaki still control the world does not require hidden beings pulling strings. Control can persist through design alone, through structures that guide behavior predictably. When systems are well designed, people choose the path laid out for them because alternatives are costly, risky, or invisible. Freedom becomes theoretical. Choice exists within boundaries. The Anunnaki, if understood as architects rather than rulers, do not need to be present. Their influence exists in the blueprint. Blueprints outlast builders. As societies grow more interconnected, control becomes even more diffuse. Global systems regulate trade, communication, and movement. No single authority commands them, yet they govern behavior across continents. This creates the impression of inevitability. Things are the way they are because that is how the world works. But the world works that way because it was structured to do so. Hidden control does not announce itself. It normalizes itself. The absence of thrones and temples does not signal the absence of power. It signals that power has become invisible enough to feel like reality itself. As this examination continues, attention turns toward how such systems maintain themselves over generations, not through force, but through inheritance, belief, and repetition, carrying forward patterns established so long ago that their origin feels indistinguishable from nature. Long after authority stopped announcing itself through gods or monuments, it found another way to persist. Not through revelation, but through inheritance. Not through divine commands spoken aloud, but through bloodlines quietly protected, repeated, and legitimized over generations. This transition did not replace earlier systems of control. It refined them. Once hierarchy was accepted as natural, the next question became who deserved to occupy its upper levels. The answer that emerged again and again was lineage. In the earlier civilizations influenced by Anunnaki tradition, rule was not earned repeatedly, it was preserved. Kingship passed through families, priesthoods became hereditary. Certain names carried weight before the individual bearing them had done anything at all. This was not an accident, it was an optimization. Bloodlines solve a fundamental problem of control. They remove uncertainty. If authority can be inherited, it does not need to be renegotiated with every generation. Succession becomes predictable. Loyalty can be cultivated early. Education, marriage, and alliances can be arranged in advance. The system stabilizes. The Anunnaki myths themselves emphasize genealogy. Gods descend from other gods. Authority flows through lineage. Even divine conflict is framed as disputes within a family structure. This framing matters. It teaches that power belongs to certain lines by default. When this logic is transferred to human society, it creates dynasties. Dynasties are more than families in power. They're continuity machines. They carry legitimacy forward by linking the present to a sanctioned past. A ruler does not need to justify his authority if it can be traced backward far enough. Age becomes evidence. Longevity becomes proof. This creates a powerful illusion. That rule is natural because it has always existed. That certain families are destined to lead because they always have. That inequality is not imposed but inherited. The persistence of chosen rule depends on memory, not accurate memory but curated memory. Histories are written to emphasize continuity. Breaks are smoothed over. Failures are reframed. Victories are mythologized. Genealogies become tools of power. Lineage is documented, embellished, sometimes invented. Bloodlines are purified on paper even when reality is more complex. What matters is not biological truth, but social acceptance. Once a bloodline is recognized as legitimate, it becomes self-reinforcing. Others seek proximity to it. Marriage becomes strategy. Loyalty becomes investment. Opposition becomes treason not just against a ruler, but against history itself. The Anunnaki narratives often describe humans created or modified to fulfill roles. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, this idea introduces a dangerous precedent, that some beings are meant to rule and others to serve. This belief survives long after the gods fade. It becomes embedded in class systems, caste systems, noble titles, and elite institutions. Access is restricted, membership is controlled, advancement is limited. Chosen rule does not require constant enforcement. It relies on acceptance. People grow up knowing where they belong. Aspiration is shaped by expectation. Even when societies claim to abandon hereditary power, traces remain. Political families emerge. Economic dynasties consolidate wealth. Cultural elites reproduce influence. The language changes, but the pattern persists. This persistence is often defended as meritocratic. Talent runs in families, experience is inherited, stability is valued. These explanations soften the reality of exclusion without dismantling it. Bloodlines offer another advantage. They personalize power while preserving structure. People can blame individuals without questioning the system. A bad ruler is an exception. A good ruler is proof the system works. This narrative protects the framework. Criticism is redirected. Reform focuses on personalities rather than architecture. The Anunnaki, as remembered, did not rule alone. They ruled collectively, councils, assemblies, hierarchies. This model translates easily into dynastic governance. Families become governing units. Power is shared internally while remaining closed externally. Over time, dynasties learn to adapt. When divine justification loses influence, they adopt new narratives: national destiny, cultural superiority, economic stewardship. Each era provides fresh language for old claims. Bloodlines also benefit from time. The longer a family remains influential, the more natural its position feels. Familiarity breeds acceptance. People stop questioning what has always been there. This is particularly effective when combined with education and tradition. Schools teach history that centers certain families. Culture celebrates their achievements. Critique is framed as disrespect. In many cases, dynasties survive regime changes. Monarchies fall, republics rise. The same families reappear in new roles: advisors, financiers, industrial leaders. Their titles change, their influence does not. This continuity suggests that chosen rule is not dependent on political form. It adapts to any system that allows concentration of power. The Anunnaki influence, if understood as structural rather than literal, fits neatly here. A system designed to organize humanity would benefit from predictable leadership. Bloodlines provide that predictability. They also provide insulation. Power can be exercised discreetly. Decisions can be made behind closed doors. Public attention focuses on symbols while influence operates elsewhere. The persistence of chosen rule also shapes how people understand success. Achievement becomes associated with background. Opportunity becomes uneven. Inequality becomes normalized. People internalize this logic. Some feel entitled. Others feel resigned. Both responses stabilize the system. Resistance becomes difficult because it lacks a clear target. Is the problem the individual, the family, the tradition, the system? Each answer leads to a different response, fragmenting opposition. Even revolutions often preserve elite continuity. New leaders emerge from familiar circles. Old names reappear with new affiliations. The structure absorbs the shock. Bloodlines are patient. They think in generations. Short-term losses are acceptable if long-term influence is preserved. This patience contrasts sharply with the lived experience of most people, whose concerns are immediate: survival, stability, opportunity. The asymmetry favours those who can wait. The Anunnaki myths emphasise long lifespans, extended perspective, planning across eras. Whether literal or symbolic, this reinforces the idea that true power operates on timescales beyond ordinary human experience. Dynasties emulate this by thinking in decades and centuries. They invest in institutions. They shape narratives. They position themselves to survive change. This long view makes them resilient. Empires rise and fall. Bloodlines adapt. Chosen rule persists not because it is always enforced, but because it is rarely challenged at its root. People argue about who should lead, not why leadership is structured the way it is. The Anunnaki are remembered as having introduced order. Dynasties preserve that order by making it hereditary. The result is a world where power feels ancient, inevitable, and distant, where influence flows through channels established so long ago that they feel like part of human nature. This does not require secret coordination. It requires continuity. As societies become more complex, dynastic influence becomes less visible but more embedded. ownership replaces rule, governance becomes management, authority becomes expertise. Bloodlines persist not only through names but through access, networks, capital, education. These are inherited as reliably as titles once were. The idea of chosen rule survives even in cultures that reject it openly. It reappears in subtle forms: legacy admissions, political families, corporate succession, cultural gatekeeping. Each form reinforces the same lesson. Some people start closer to power than others. This lesson is learned early and rarely forgotten. If the Anunnaki still control the world, it would not be through direct command. It would be through systems that favour continuity over disruption, inheritance over randomness, stability over equity. Bloodlines are the quiet carriers of such systems. They move through history unnoticed by those focused on surface change. As this examination continues, attention shifts toward how these inherited structures interact with law, tradition, and modern institutions, further entrenching patterns of control that feel permanent precisely because they appear ordinary. There are rules that feel newer than the buildings around them, and there are rules that feel older than memory itself. These are the laws that seem to exist before debate, before government, before choice. They are not tied to a single nation, ruler, or moment in history. They persist through collapse, reform, conquest, and revolution. They change language, but not function. They are the systems that survived their makers. Long before modern legal codes were drafted, the idea of law was already framed as something discovered rather than created. In the earlier civilizations influenced by Anunnaki tradition, law was not presented as human agreement. It was revealed, inscribed, handed down. Kings did not claim authorship, they claimed custody. This distinction is critical. A law that is created can be questioned. A law that is revealed cannot. Ancient law codes repeatedly emphasize their age. They anchor themselves to divine origin, cosmic order, or ancestral wisdom. Hammurabi does not say he invented justice. He says it was given to him. Moses does not propose commandments. He receives them. Across cultures, law arrives from elsewhere, already complete. This framing removes law from the realm of negotiation. It positions obedience as alignment with reality, rather than submission to authority. To break the law is not merely to defy rulers, but to disrupt order itself. The Anunnaki narratives reinforce this idea by associating law with structure. Me are not optional guidelines. They are the conditions under which civilization functions. Without them, chaos returns. Floods come, crops fail, cities collapse. Once law is framed as foundational, it becomes extremely resilient. It can be adapted, translated, and expanded, but it cannot be discarded without threatening the entire system built upon it. As civilizations grow and interact, these legal concepts spread. Conquerors rarely abolish existing laws entirely. They modify them, integrate them, claim continuity. Even empires that pride themselves on innovation rely heavily on inherited legal frameworks. Rome absorbed laws from earlier cultures. Medieval Europe adapted Roman law. Modern legal systems still reflect principles codified thousands of years ago. Property, contract, debt, punishment, authority. These concepts remain remarkably consistent. What changes is not the structure, but the justification. Where ancient law invoked gods, later law invokes reason. Where once obedience was sacred, it becomes civic. Where justice was divine balance, it becomes social order. The effect is the same. Compliance is required. Consequences follow deviation. One of the most enduring features of ancient legal systems is their impersonality. Laws apply regardless of individual circumstance. This abstraction is often celebrated as fairness, but it also serves control. When law is impersonal, it feels inevitable. There is no one to argue with, no face to appeal to. This impersonality mirrors the Anunnaki legacy closely. Authority without intimacy, power without presence. Law also serves as memory. It preserves decisions long after the decision makers are gone. A law written once can shape behaviour for centuries. People obey rules whose origin they do not know, whose purpose they no longer understand. This temporal distance protects the system. The older a law feels, the more legitimate it appears. Age becomes authority. In many societies, tradition itself becomes a legal argument. Something is done a certain way because it has always been done that way. This circular reasoning is difficult to challenge because it lacks a clear starting point. Legal systems often resist change not because they are optimal, but because they are embedded. Entire institutions are built around them. Careers depend on them. Identities are shaped by them. The Anunnaki, as remembered, introduced order through categorization. They defined roles, boundaries, and consequences. Law is the formalization of that impulse. It divides behavior into acceptable and unacceptable. It assigns penalties. It regulates interaction. Once these divisions exist, society reorganizes itself around them. People plan their lives within legal constraints. Businesses operate within regulatory frameworks. Relationships are defined by legal recognition. Law becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure is rarely questioned until it fails. Roads, water systems, power grids, law functions similarly. It fades into the background until disruption occurs. At that point, its importance becomes visible, but its structure remains unquestioned. Revolutions often target rulers, not laws. Even when legal systems are rewritten, they retain familiar forms. Constitutions replace codes, rights replace commandments, but enforcement mechanisms remain. Courts, judges, police, bureaucracy. The persistence of law across political systems suggests that it serves deeper functions than governance alone. It stabilizes expectations. It reduces uncertainty. It allows large populations to coordinate without constant negotiation. These are valuable outcomes. They also enable control. The Anunnaki stories often describe punishment not as vengeance, but as restoration of balance. Law follows this logic. Penalties are framed as necessary corrections rather than coercion. This framing legitimizes enforcement. People accept punishment when it is portrayed as maintenance rather than domination. Legal language reinforces this. Terms like order, security, stability, and justice carry positive connotations. They obscure the power dynamics involved. Another key feature of ancient law is its alignment with hierarchy. Laws rarely apply equally in practice, even when they claim to in principle. Status matters. Rank matters. Access matters. This inequality is often justified through complexity. Legal systems are difficult to navigate without expertise. Those with resources can interpret and manipulate them. Those without must comply blindly. This creates a stratified experience of law. For some, it is a tool. For others, a boundary. The Anunnaki legacy emphasizes knowledge as power. Law embodies this perfectly. Understanding the rules grants influence. Ignorance invites punishment. Legal systems often expand over time. New regulations accumulate. Exceptions multiply. Complexity increases. This expansion does not necessarily increase fairness. It increases control. The more rules exist, the more opportunities there are to violate them. Selective enforcement becomes possible. Authority gains discretion. Discretion is power. Systems that outlive their makers tend to develop this feature. They adapt to new conditions while preserving core functions. Law absorbs change without surrendering control. Modern legal systems govern domains unimaginable to ancient lawmakers. Digital data, global trade, genetic information. Yet they rely on principles that would be familiar to early administrators: ownership, responsibility, liability, authority. This continuity suggests that the foundational logic has remained intact. The Anunnaki, if interpreted as system builders, would not need to remain involved once such logic was embedded. Law enforces itself through institutions and social norms. People internalize legal expectations, they self-regulate, they anticipate consequences. This reduces the need for constant enforcement. Law becomes psychological. Children learn rules early. School mirrors legal structure, rules, punishments, appeals, authority. By adulthood, legal obedience feels natural. This training is rarely recognized as such. It is framed as socialization, responsibility, maturity. The result is a population accustomed to external regulation. Freedom is defined within legal boundaries rather than beyond them. Even movements that seek reform often operate through legal channels. They demand new laws, better enforcement, fairer systems. This reinforces the legitimacy of law itself. Rarely is the underlying structure questioned. Why law takes the form it does. Why certain behaviors are regulated. Why authority is centralized. These questions feel abstract, impractical, dangerous. Law also benefits from moral framing. Justice is presented as objective, neutral, necessary. This discourages scrutiny. The Anunnaki myths often portray law as cosmic, a reflection of universal order. Modern systems replace cosmos with constitution, but the reverence remains. Breaking the law is framed not only as harmful, but as wrong. This moralization strengthens compliance. Systems that outlive their makers depend on this moralization. Without it, enforcement becomes costly. The persistence of ancient legal structures into the present suggests that they serve enduring functions. They organize societies, they allocate resources, they manage conflict, they also preserve hierarchy. Even when laws are rewritten to promote equality, enforcement often reflects existing power dynamics. Those with influence shape interpretation, those without bear consequences. This is not always intentional, it is systemic. The Anunnaki stories do not depict a utopia. They depict a managed world. Order is prioritized over fairness, stability over freedom. Law reflects this priority. As centuries pass, the origin of legal authority becomes increasingly abstract. Few people know where specific laws came from. Fewer still question why they exist. Law becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Nations define themselves by their legal systems. Constitutions are celebrated. Courts are revered. Law is treated as the backbone of civilization. This reverence obscures its function as control. Control that feels older than nations feels permanent, inevitable, natural. If the Anunnaki still control the world, it would not be through commands or appearances. It would be through systems like law that continue to shape behavior long after their origins are forgotten. Law does not need belief. It needs participation. Every contract signed, every fine paid, every rule followed reinforces the system. Systems that outlive their makers succeed by becoming invisible. They fade into the background of daily life. Law is one of the most successful examples. As this examination moves forward, attention shifts toward how such systems interact with technology, resources, and progress, extending their reach while maintaining the same underlying logic that has governed human societies since the earliest days of structured power. As human societies moved beyond agriculture and administration into eras defined by invention, expansion, and acceleration, the structures of control did not weaken. They adapted. Technology did not dissolve hierarchy. Resources did not democratize power. Progress did not flatten influence. Instead, each of these forces became a quieter extension of systems already in place, amplifying reach while concealing intent. What appears as advancement often functions as refinement. In early civilizations, control depended on physical proximity. Fields had to be watched, storehouses guarded, labor supervised. As tools improved and populations grew, Direct oversight became impractical. Technology emerged as the solution, not merely to increase productivity, but to reduce the need for visible control. The Anunnaki traditions emphasize instruction over domination. They teach humans how to build, measure, extract, and organize. This emphasis is important. A population that understands tools will apply them voluntarily. Once techniques are learned, enforcement becomes unnecessary. Technology becomes a carrier of intention. Every major technological shift has been accompanied by promises of liberation. Tools that save time, machines that reduce labor, networks that connect people, systems that increase efficiency. These promises are not false, but they are incomplete. Each advancement also introduces new dependencies, new hierarchies, and new forms of regulation. Early irrigation systems centralized water control. Whoever managed canals managed survival. Metallurgy concentrated power through weapons and tools. Writing concentrated authority through record keeping. Each innovation increased output while narrowing control. This pattern persists. Modern technology centralizes influence not through force, but through access. Those who design systems shape behavior. Those who own infrastructure set terms. Those who control distribution determine availability. The Anunnaki, as remembered, were associated with knowledge of materials, construction, and measurement. These are foundational technologies. They determine what can be built, how resources are allocated, and who benefits. Once these foundations are established, progress follows predictable channels. Development favors those already positioned to exploit it. Inequality expands quietly under the banner of advancement. Resource management reveals this clearly. From the earliest grain stores to modern energy grids, control over resources translates directly into power. Scarcity can be created or alleviated. Abundance can be directed. Access can be conditioned. This does not require malice. It requires structure. Systems that regulate resources often present themselves as neutral. Markets, supply chains, logistics, algorithms. These systems operate according to rules that appear objective but reflect embedded priorities. Efficiency, profit, stability, growth. These priorities shape outcomes. When technology mediates access to resources, control becomes invisible. People experience limitation without encountering authority. Prices rise, availability shifts, services change, explanations reference complexity rather than decision. This opacity protects the system. When outcomes feel technical, responsibility diffuses. Progress narratives reinforce this diffusion. Change is framed as inevitable. Technological adoption is presented as necessity. Resistance is labelled impractical or aggressive. This framing discourages scrutiny. The Anunnaki legacy, if understood structurally, aligns perfectly with this mode of operation. A system designed to persist would embed itself in the mechanisms of improvement. It would guide progress along paths that reinforce existing hierarchies while appearing beneficial. Human history demonstrates this repeatedly. Advances that increase productivity rarely reduce inequality on their own. They redistribute it upward unless countered deliberately. Technology accelerates processes. It does not question their purpose. As societies industrialize, control shifts further from physical space into abstract systems. Factories replace fields. Corporations replace clans. Data replaces observation. Workers no longer see the full process of production. Consumers no longer see the source of goods. Decision-makers operate at distances that make consequences abstract. This separation benefits control. Distance reduces accountability. Complexity reduces understanding. The language of progress obscures these effects. Innovation is celebrated. Growth is praised. Disruption is admired. The costs are framed as transitional. Over time, these transitions become permanent. Resource extraction follows a similar pattern. Early societies extracted what they needed locally. Modern systems extract globally. The scale increases, the distance grows, the impact disperses. Control over resources becomes geopolitical. Agreements replace conquests. Contracts replace tribute. Influence replaces occupation. This shift makes power harder to see. It also makes it harder to challenge. The Anunnaki stories often associate gods with specific domains: water, fire, earth, sky. These domains correspond to resources. Control over elements translates into control over life. Modern systems manage these same domains: energy, minerals, agriculture, climate. The language is scientific rather than mythic, but the function remains. Those who manage resources shape possibilities. Progress also introduces time pressure, faster production, shorter cycles, constant updates. This acceleration benefits systems of control by reducing reflection. People adapt continuously without pausing to question direction. Urgency replaces deliberation. Technology demands participation. To function socially and economically, individuals must engage with systems they did not design and cannot alter. Opting out becomes costly. This participation reinforces control. Every interaction feeds data. Every transaction strengthens infrastructure. Use becomes endorsement. Even critique often relies on the same systems. Dissent is expressed through platforms owned by the structures it opposes. This paradox diffuses resistance. The silent hand guiding progress does not suppress opposition. It absorbs it. Education reinforces this dynamic. Skills are taught to meet technological demands. Training aligns with market needs. Curiosity is shaped by applicability. Knowledge becomes instrumental. This instrumentalization aligns with administrative logic. Understanding is valuable insofar as it serves the system. Questions that do not translate into output are deprioritized. The Anunnaki emphasis on instruction rather than enlightenment fits this pattern. Teaching how to function within a system rather than why it exists ensures continuity. Progress narratives also shape identity. People define themselves by productivity. Worth becomes measurable. Time becomes optimized. This internalization of system values reduces the need for external enforcement. People push themselves. Burnout is reframed as individual failure rather than structural design. Resource scarcity is framed as natural rather than engineered. Technology also reshapes perception. Interfaces mediate reality. Algorithms curate information. Attention is guided. Control over attention is control over thought. This is perhaps the most subtle form of influence. What people see shapes what they consider possible. What they do not see fades from consideration. The Anunnaki myths emphasize knowledge control. Tablets, secrets, forbidden understanding. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is consistent. Access to information determines power. Modern systems replicate this through data ownership. Proprietary algorithms, restricted research, classified information, paywalled knowledge. Information abundance does not equal information access. Noise obscures signal. Complexity overwhelms comprehension. Progress becomes spectacle. Devices improve. Systems expand. But underlying power relations remain stable. The promise of technology as equalizer persists, yet outcomes suggest reinforcement. Those with resources leverage technology to gain more. Those without adapt to survive. This adaptation is framed as resilience. Control through progress also benefits from optimism. People want to believe that advancement leads to improvement. This belief discourages critique. Questioning progress feels like pessimism. Systems exploit this sentiment. The silent hand does not push overtly. It nudges, incentivizes, shapes environments so that certain choices feel obvious. Urban design influences movement. Digital platforms influence interaction. Economic structures influence aspiration. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires alignment. The Anunnaki influence, interpreted structurally, would manifest exactly this way, not as direct intervention, but as foundational design that channels development. Once systems are aligned with certain priorities, progress follows those priorities automatically. Humanity advances, but along predetermined tracks. The idea of progress itself becomes a control mechanism. It frames the future as improvement while deflecting attention from distribution. Who benefits? Who decides? Progress becomes a narrative rather than a metric. Technology amplifies reach. Resources amplify leverage. Progress amplifies legitimacy. Together, they form a self-reinforcing loop. Advancement justifies control. Control directs advancement. The silent hand does not need to be hidden intentionally. It is hidden by complexity, distance, and normalization. People experience the benefits of progress directly. Convenience, speed, access. These experiences create loyalty. Gratitude replaces scrutiny. Costs are externalized. Environmental damage, social fragmentation, psychological strain. These are treated as side effects rather than structural outcomes. The system persists because it delivers enough benefit to maintain participation. This balance is delicate. Too much harm invites unrest. Too much control invites resistance. Systems adapt to maintain equilibrium. The Anunnaki stories describe gods who debate balance. Too much burden leads to rebellion. Too little order leads to chaos. Management is key. Modern systems operate on the same principle. Regulation increases or decreases to stabilize productivity. Social policies adjust to maintain compliance. Control through technology and progress is dynamic. It responds to feedback. It evolves. This evolution makes it difficult to trace origin. Changes appear incremental. Adaptations feel necessary. Over time, the direction of progress becomes taken for granted. Alternatives are forgotten. The silent hand shapes not only what is built, but what is imagined. Futures are designed within existing frameworks. Radical change becomes unimaginable. This imagination constraint is one of the most effective forms of control. People cannot pursue what they cannot conceive. If the Anunnaki still influence the world, it would not be through machines or directives. It would be through the logic embedded in progress itself, a logic that values order, efficiency, and continuity above all. Technology becomes the language of this logic, resources its currency, progress its justification. The hand remains unseen because it operates through tools people choose to use. As this examination moves forward, attention turns toward why certain stories persist across cultures and eras, repeating themes of watchers, overseers, and hidden guidance, not as fantasies, but as reflections of lived experience within systems that shape humanity quietly, constantly, and without interruption. Across centuries, across languages, across continents that never met, certain stories keep resurfacing. They change names, they adapt to local customs, they wear different symbols. But beneath those surface differences, their structure remains remarkably consistent. Figures who arrive from elsewhere, teachers who bring order, watchers who withdraw but never truly leave, overseers who shape humanity without ruling openly. These myths do not fade the way others do. They persist. This persistence is not accidental. Most myths serve a purpose tied to a specific culture or moment. They explain local geography, justify a particular lineage, or encode moral lessons relevant to daily life. When the culture changes, those myths lose relevance and quietly disappear. But the stories connected to figures like the Anunnaki behave differently. They travel, they survive conquest, they resurface after suppression. They adapt to new belief systems without losing their core themes. That kind of endurance suggests that these stories are anchored to something deeper than entertainment or religion. They resonate because they mirror patterns people continue to experience. In the earliest Mesopotamian records, the Anunnaki are not whimsical characters. They are administrators of reality. They assign roles, regulate labour, establish boundaries, and enforce order. Later cultures reinterpret similar figures. The Watchers in Hebrew tradition, the Apkallu, the Titans, the civilizing gods of Mesoamerica, the sky beings of indigenous traditions, the teachers who arrive, instruct, withdraw, and leave humanity to manage what was given. The repetition is striking, so is the timing. These myths almost always appear at moments of transition, when societies are reorganizing, centralizing, or formalizing power. They surface when authority is being justified, when hierarchy is being normalized, when obedience is being framed as alignment with a higher order. Stories like these do not function as explanations of the natural world. They function as explanations of social order. When people live under systems that feel imposed, distant, and unchangeable, they tend to imagine those systems as originating beyond humanity. This relieves psychological tension. If power comes from elsewhere, resistance feels futile. Acceptance feels rational. Myths encode this logic without stating it directly. The Anunnaki stories present control as necessary. Humanity is described as chaotic, overburdened, or incapable of sustaining civilization without guidance. Order is portrayed as a gift, structure as salvation, labour as purpose. These narratives do not ask for belief, they ask for acceptance. As societies evolve, the literal belief in gods may fade, but the narrative function remains. Stories shift from myth to philosophy, from religion to ideology, from scripture to science. The language changes, but the message persists. Humanity requires management. Order must be imposed. Guidance must come from above. This is why such myths refuse to die. They are not about beings, they are about systems. When new empires rise, they inherit these stories because they are useful. They provide continuity. They legitimize authority. They frame power as ancient, inevitable, and aligned with cosmic order. Even when empires reject earlier religions, they often preserve the mythic structure. Roman emperors discarded many gods but embraced divine legitimacy. Medieval rulers replaced pantheons with monotheism but preserved hierarchy. Modern states abandon divinity but elevate abstract principles that function similarly. Progress, security, stability, growth. These concepts occupy the same psychological space once held by gods. The persistence of Watcher myths is especially revealing. Figures who observe rather than rule directly appear across cultures. They see everything. They intervene rarely. Their judgment is implicit. This mirrors how modern systems operate. Surveillance replaces presence. Metrics replace commands. Oversight replaces rule. People sense this intuitively. They feel watched without seeing watchers. They feel guided without receiving guidance. Myths give shape to that experience. Stories also survive because they offer continuity in times of uncertainty. When systems become complex and opaque, people reach for narratives that explain why things feel controlled yet impersonal. Myths provide symbolic clarity. The Anunnaki become a way to talk about power without naming institutions. They allow discussion of control without confronting it directly. This is why such stories reappear in popular culture, alternative history, and speculative thought. They offer language for unease that formal discourse often avoids. Official narratives tend to emphasize agency, choice, freedom, opportunity. Yet lived experience often contradicts this. Many feel constrained by forces they cannot identify or influence. Myths bridge that gap. They acknowledge constraint without demanding revolt. They say, this is how things have always been. The durability of these stories also lies in their adaptability. They can be interpreted literally, symbolically, psychologically, or politically. They survive skepticism because they do not depend on a single reading. A literalist sees ancient beings. A skeptic sees allegory. A historian sees social memory. A modern listener sees systems. All interpretations coexist without cancelling each other. This flexibility allows the myth to pass through eras that reject earlier belief systems. When gods become unacceptable, they become metaphors. When metaphors become unfashionable, they become archetypes. When archetypes are questioned, they become patterns. Patterns are harder to dismiss. The Anunnaki myths also persist because they address scale. Human life is short. Systems are long. Myths give a sense of continuity that individual experience cannot provide. They connect personal struggle to a vast timeline. This can be comforting. It can also be disempowering. If control is ancient and pervasive, resistance feels naive. Acceptance feels mature. Myths often resolve this tension by portraying rebellion as catastrophic. Floods, exile, collapse. Those who defy the order suffer. Those who comply survive. This lesson is repeated subtly across cultures. Order preserves, chaos destroys. Such framing discourages questioning at the root level. Change becomes something to manage carefully, not something to pursue boldly. The persistence of these stories also reflects how knowledge is transmitted. Myths are memorable. They compress complex ideas into narratives. They survive oral transmission. They adapt to new audiences. Systems of control benefit from this. They do not need to explain themselves in technical detail if they can be felt emotionally. Fear, or gratitude, obligation. The Anunnaki narratives evoke all of these. They also blur responsibility. If gods designed the system, humans merely maintain it. Blame shifts upward. Accountability diffuses. This diffusion persists today. People blame systems, markets, history, technology. Rarely do they identify human design. Myths reinforce this abstraction. Even when myths are dismissed, their structure often remains embedded in thought. People speak of invisible hands, forces beyond control, systems too big to change. These phrases are secular myths. The refusal of these stories to die suggests they are rooted in recurring human experience, rather than isolated imagination. Each generation encounters systems that feel older than them, larger than them, resistant to them. They look for language to describe that feeling. Myths provide it. The Anunnaki become one name among many for a recurring pattern. The sense that order precedes us, that rules existed before we arrived, that our role is to participate rather than redesign. This sense is not inherently false. Systems do predate individuals, but myths shape how that fact is interpreted, as inevitability rather than choice, as destiny rather than design. This shaping matters, because stories do not just reflect reality, they influence behaviour. If people believe control is ancient and unchangeable, they adapt to it. If they believe it is recent and constructed, they challenge it. Myths that refuse to die tend to support the former interpretation. They encourage endurance rather than disruption. This does not mean they are deliberately deceptive. Myths emerge organically. They crystallize shared understanding. They preserve lessons learned through experience. The lesson preserved here may be simple. Large systems outlast individuals. They shape lives invisibly. They demand compliance. They reward alignment. Naming this experience does not eliminate it, but it does make it legible. As these stories continue to circulate, reappear and transform, they serve as quiet reminders that something beneath surface change remains consistent, that beneath new technologies, new governments, and new languages, familiar patterns persist. And as attention turns toward those who observe, record, and debate these patterns, the next part of this examination moves into the uneasy space between belief and dismissal, where skeptics, scholars, and careful observers circle the same questions from different directions, each constrained in their own way by the systems they seek to understand. When control no longer needs to announce itself, it adopts a different posture. It does not command, it does not threaten, it does not even instruct directly. It observes, regulates conditions, and allows outcomes to emerge within carefully defined boundaries. From the outside, it appears absent. From within, it feels inescapable. This distinction between observers and overseers is subtle, but essential. An overseer issues orders. An observer shapes the environment so that certain behaviors become likely and others rare. One governs through force, the other through structure. In the earliest Anunnaki traditions, the gods are not constantly intervening in human affairs. They convene councils, they deliberate, they set decrees. Much of what follows unfolds without their direct presence. Humans act, cities grow, conflicts arise, consequences follow. The gods watch. Occasionally they correct. Most of the time, they do not need to. This model of control is far more durable than constant supervision. It reduces friction. It minimizes resistance. It allows participants to feel autonomous while remaining constrained. Visibility is expensive. It invites scrutiny. It provokes challenge. Invisibility, by contrast, feels like nature. When systems operate without visible rulers, people stop asking who is in charge and start asking how things work. The shift is profound. Questions of power become questions of procedure. Ethics become logistics. Responsibility dissolves into process. This is control optimized. Observers do not need to act often because the system acts for them. Feedback loops replace commands. Incentives replace threats. Norms replace laws. Modern societies are saturated with these mechanisms. Credit scores influence behavior without issuing orders. Algorithms curate information without explaining criteria. Schedules regulate time without demanding obedience. People comply because deviation carries cost. The absence of visible authority does not mean the absence of authority. It means authority has been abstracted. The Anunnaki, if understood as architects rather than rulers, would not require temples or thrones to maintain influence. Their role would be complete once systems reach self-regulation. At that point, intervention would be inefficient. Observers monitor outcomes. Overseers intervene directly. Mature systems favour observation. This distinction also shapes how accountability is perceived. When something goes wrong under direct rule, blame is clear. When something goes wrong under abstract systems, blame disperses. Individuals blame circumstances. Institutions blame complexity. No single entity accepts responsibility. This diffusion protects the system. Visibility also creates emotional response. Anger, loyalty, fear. Invisibility creates resignation, adaptation, rationalization. People resist what they can see. They adjust to what they cannot. Surveillance offers a modern illustration of this principle. Early control relied on guards, watchtowers, and physical presence. Modern surveillance relies on data, logs, metadata, patterns, observation without confrontation. People modify behavior not because someone is watching visibly, but because they might be. The uncertainty is enough. This is not speculation. It is documented. Environments perceived as monitored produce compliance even when monitoring is minimal. Observation changes behavior. The Anunnaki myths often emphasize omniscience. The gods see all, nothing is hidden. This is not about physical sight. It is about awareness, knowledge without presence. That idea survives in secular form, systems that track, measure, record, evaluate. Once behavior is quantified, it can be shaped. Metrics replace judgment. Targets replace values. Performance replaces intention. People align themselves with numbers because numbers determine outcomes. This alignment creates a form of self-governance. Individuals internalize system goals. They push themselves to comply without being asked. This is the observer's advantage. Influence without effort. Control without visibility also benefits from plausibility. When authority is visible, it must justify itself. When authority is invisible, outcomes are attributed to circumstance. Economic hardship is blamed on markets, social inequality on complexity, technological disruption on inevitability, rarely is design acknowledged. This misattribution stabilizes control. People adapt rather than resist. The Anunnaki narratives often frame disasters as corrections rather than punishments. Floods restore balance, collapse resets order. These events are not portrayed as moral judgment, but as systemic response. This framing persists. Crises are treated as failures of systems, not failures of power. Solutions focus on repair, not redesign. Observers do not intervene emotionally. They adjust parameters. This approach also reduces the need for legitimacy. Visible rulers require belief. Invisible systems require participation. As long as people engage, legitimacy is assumed. Participation becomes compulsory through dependency. Opting out carries cost. Control without visibility thrives in environments where alternatives are limited or invisible. When all options exist within the same framework, choice becomes symbolic. People choose between paths that lead to the same destination. The Anunnaki myths sometimes describe humans as unaware of the full structure governing their lives. Knowledge is restricted. Secrets are kept. Revelation is dangerous. This mirrors modern experience. Systems are too complex for any individual to understand fully. Specialization fragments knowledge. Expertise is siloed. No one sees the whole. This fragmentation benefits observers. Without a comprehensive view, coordinated challenge is difficult. Even those within the system often understand only their portion. Administrators follow protocols. Engineers optimize components. Policymakers respond to data. Each acts rationally within limited scope. The system persists regardless of individual intention. Observers or overseers without visibility do not need loyalty. They need predictability. They do not need worship. They need compliance. Compliance is easier to secure when people believe outcomes are natural rather than imposed. This belief is reinforced through language, trends, forces, pressures. These terms describe influence without agency. Language matters. It shapes perception. When power is described impersonally, it feels unavoidable. The Anunnaki, remembered as distant figures who withdrew, fit this pattern precisely. Their absence becomes part of their authority. They are beyond appeal, beyond challenge. This distance creates a sense of finality. Decisions feel settled. Structures feel complete. Modern systems replicate this by presenting rules as technical. Regulatory frameworks are justified by expertise, economic models by mathematics, technological systems by efficiency. Challenging these requires specialized knowledge. Most people lack access. As a result, critique often focuses on outcomes rather than design, symptoms rather than causes. Observers remain unseen. Control without visibility also reshapes resistance. When power is visible, resistance is confrontational. When power is invisible, resistance becomes fragmented, personal, isolated. People blame themselves. They adjust behavior. They seek optimization rather than change. This internalization is one of the most effective control mechanisms available. The Anunnaki stories include warnings about forbidden knowledge. Humans who learn too much disrupt order. This suggests an awareness that understanding systems threatens their stability. Modern equivalents exist: whistleblowers, leaks, transparency movements. These provoke strong reactions because they expose structure. Exposure reintroduces visibility. Visibility invites challenge. Systems respond by reabsorbing exposure, normalizing it, overwhelming it with noise. Complexity returns. Observers remain out of focus. Another advantage of invisible control is deniability. When no one is visibly in charge, no one can be accused. Decisions are attributed to necessity. This creates moral distance. Harm becomes unfortunate rather than unjust. Responsibility dissolves. The Anunnaki myths often depict humans appealing to gods who do not respond directly. Silence is part of the relationship. Silence reinforces authority. It signals finality. In modern systems, silence takes the form of automated responses, denied applications, unexplained decisions, unreachable institutions. Appeal processes exist, but they operate within the same framework. They rarely challenge foundational logic. Observers do not need to explain themselves. They rely on structure. This model of control is resilient because it does not depend on belief in any particular narrative. It survives secularization. It survives skepticism. It survives cynicism. People may distrust institutions, but they still rely on them. They may criticize systems, but they still participate. Dependency replaces belief. The Anunnaki influence, understood structurally, would manifest exactly this way. Not as rulers issuing commands, but as designers whose systems no longer require supervision. Their presence would be felt only through persistence. Control without visibility also benefits from time. Over generations, systems become normalized. Children are born into them, alternatives are forgotten. What was once imposed becomes assumed. This assumption is rarely examined because it feels like reality itself. Observers do not need to hide actively. They hide by becoming background. The most effective power is the one that is mistaken for environment. As this examination moves forward, attention shifts toward those who attempt to name, study, or dismiss these patterns. Scholars, skeptics, believers. Each approaches the same structures from different angles, constrained by the limits of their frameworks, and in doing so, reveals how difficult it is to see what does not announce itself. Whenever ideas touch power, they attract three kinds of attention: those who believe too easily, those who reject too quickly, and those who remain caught between, uneasy, cautious, and often unheard. The question of lingering Anunnaki influence sits precisely in that middle ground, a space occupied by skeptics, scholars, and observers who sense that something important is being discussed, even if the language used to discuss it feels inadequate. Skeptics approach the subject with confidence. From their perspective, ancient gods are myths, products of pre-scientific societies attempting to explain natural phenomena. Floods become allegories, sky beings become metaphors, tablets become literature. For skeptics, the case is closed. The Anunnaki do not exist because beings like that cannot exist. The discussion ends there. This position offers comfort. It provides certainty. It reassures modern identity. Humanity outgrew superstition. Reason replaced myth. Progress moved forward. But skepticism often addresses the wrong question. Most skeptics argue against literal beings, physical entities arriving from the sky. They dismantle claims of spacecraft, advanced technology, or extraterrestrial genetics. In doing so, they defeat arguments that many serious observers are not making in the first place. The more unsettling possibility is not that ancient gods were real in a literal sense, but that the systems attributed to them were real, deliberate, and enduring. Skepticism aimed solely at mythology leaves structure untouched. Scholars occupy a different position. Historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and philologists engage with Anunnaki texts as cultural artifacts. They translate tablets, compare myths, trace linguistic patterns. Their work is precise, cautious, and bounded by method. Within academic frameworks, the Anunnaki are studied as part of Sumerian religion and governance. They are understood as reflections of early social organization. Gods personify forces, myths encode values, texts legitimize authority. This scholarship is valuable. It grounds discussion. It prevents fantasy from overtaking evidence, but it also has limits. Academic disciplines often isolate questions to remain credible. They analyze content without following implication too far. They describe what ancient people believed without asking how those beliefs continue to shape modern structures. This restraint is not accidental. Academia survives by avoiding conclusions that threaten existing paradigms. Scholars describe systems. They rarely challenge the systems that support their work. As a result, an uncomfortable gap opens between dismissal and description. On one side, skeptics deny the relevance of ancient narratives altogether. On the other, scholars analyse those narratives while stopping short of exploring their long-term influence on power, hierarchy and control. Between them sits the middle ground. This middle ground is occupied by people who notice continuity, who see that ancient systems of authority resemble modern ones too closely to dismiss as coincidence, who recognise that myths may preserve memory rather than fantasy, who sense that power does not reinvent itself with every era but evolves. This position is uncomfortable because it lacks institutional support. It is dismissed by skeptics as speculative and ignored by scholars as too broad. It exists without a home. Those in this space are not claiming certainty. They're asking different questions. Instead of asking whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, they ask what functions the Anunnaki narrative served, why those functions were necessary, why they persist, why similar patterns appear independently across cultures. These are structural questions, not mythological ones. The discomfort arises because these questions point toward design, and design implies intention. Modern thought prefers emergence over intention. Systems happen, markets evolve, societies develop, complexity increases. No one planned it, no one controls it. This narrative is reassuring. It absolves responsibility. But the historical record complicates this view. Early systems were planned. Laws were written deliberately. Hierarchies were enforced intentionally. Resources were allocated strategically. Someone decided. The Anunnaki narratives may be mythologized accounts of those decisions, or symbolic representations of elites, or metaphors for abstract processes, or something else entirely. What matters is not their literal truth, but their persistence. Skeptics often underestimate this persistence. They assume that once belief fades, influence fades with it. History suggests otherwise. Beliefs disappear. Structures remain. Scholars document this persistence in fragments: legal continuity, administrative inheritance, cultural norms, but they rarely connect these fragments into a single, unsettling picture. That picture suggests that modern systems are not as novel as they appear. The middle ground recognises that ancient myths may encode real transitions, moments when power centralised, when labour was organised, when obedience was normalised, when authority became abstract. The Anunnaki are remembered at precisely such a moment. This does not require extraterrestrials, it requires organisation. But this interpretation raises uncomfortable implications. If modern systems descend from ancient designs, then progress is not a clean break from the past, it is refinement. That challenges the narrative of liberation. Skeptics resist this because it undermines confidence in rational progress. Scholars resist it because it blurs disciplinary boundaries. Institutions resist it because it questions legitimacy. The middle ground persists quietly. Those who occupy it often feel isolated. They are told they are reading too much into myths, or that systems are too complex to have origins, or that drawing connections across millennia is irresponsible. Yet humans do exactly this in other contexts. We trace languages, we trace genes, we trace legal principles, we trace cultural practices. Tracing power should not be different. The discomfort also arises because this line of inquiry lacks villains. There is no single enemy, no conspiracy to expose, no secret meeting to reveal. Control in this view is systemic, distributed, inherited. It operates without malice. This makes it difficult to oppose and difficult to discuss. The Anunnaki become a symbol for this difficulty. They represent the moment when power became something larger than individuals, something that could persist beyond its creators. Skeptics mock this symbol. Scholars contextualize it. The middle ground treats it as a lens. This lens reveals that belief and disbelief are both incomplete responses. One accepts too easily, the other dismisses too quickly. Understanding requires patience. It also requires humility. The humility to admit that modern systems may not be entirely of our own making, that we inherited structures without consent, that we operate within frameworks designed long before us. This is not a comfortable realization. It challenges narratives of autonomy. It complicates ideas of freedom. It raises questions about responsibility. If systems are inherited, how much agency do individuals truly have? If control is embedded, where does change begin? These questions rarely receive serious attention because they destabilize assumptions. Scholars often encounter fragments of this realization. They see continuity in law, persistence in hierarchy, repetition in myth, but their training encourages compartmentalization. Skeptics encounter the same fragments and dismiss them as coincidence. The middle ground attempts synthesis. It is not about belief. It is about pattern recognition. Patterns do not prove intention, but they invite investigation. The persistence of administrative logic from ancient Mesopotamia to modern governance is not speculative. It is documented. The continuity of hierarchical organization is not imaginary. It is observable. The Anunnaki narratives cluster around these developments. This clustering deserves attention, yet attention brings risk. Those who ask these questions are often labelled conspiratorial, even when they avoid claims of hidden beings or secret rulers. This label functions as a boundary. It protects mainstream discourse by discouraging exploration. The middle ground exists precisely because of this boundary. It is where curiosity survives without institutional endorsement. It is not a position of certainty. It is a position of suspicion toward easy answers. Skeptics offer easy dismissal. Scholars offer careful description without implication. The middle ground offers discomfort. Discomfort is often the beginning of understanding. This space also highlights the limits of language. Terms like control, influence, power carry emotional weight. They trigger defensiveness. Reframing the discussion in terms of systems, inheritance, and continuity reduces that defensiveness, but does not eliminate it. People prefer to believe they are free within structures they chose. Admitting inheritance without choice feels threatening. The Anunnaki, whether mythic or symbolic, represent inheritance without consent. Systems introduced before memory. Rules learned before understanding. This resonates because it mirrors lived experience. Children do not choose systems. They adapt to them. Societies rarely choose foundational structures. They inherit them. This realization sits uneasily between belief and skepticism. It does not require gods. It does not require aliens. It requires history. The middle ground does not claim answers. It asks why certain questions feel forbidden, why examining ancient influence feels acceptable in art but not in politics, why continuity is celebrated in culture but ignored in power. These inconsistencies suggest discomfort rather than irrelevance. The Anunnaki discussion persists because it touches this discomfort. It offers a language to talk about inherited systems without naming modern institutions directly. It allows reflection without confrontation. This may explain why such discussions are tolerated on the margins but discouraged in formal settings. Margins are where uncomfortable ideas survive. The middle ground is not a destination. It is a pause, a space where certainty is withheld. It allows the possibility that ancient systems shaped modern realities more deeply than acknowledged. It allows the possibility that control does not require controllers, only continuity. As this exploration continues, the focus shifts away from debates about belief and disbelief and toward implications. If inherited systems persist, what does that mean for autonomy, choice, and responsibility today? Those questions cannot be answered by skeptics or scholars alone. They require stepping into the discomfort and staying there long enough to see what emerges. If the Anunnaki never truly left, not as beings walking among us, but as architects of systems that continue to function without them, then freedom and choice take on a different meaning. Not an absent meaning, but a constrained one. One shaped long before any individual entered the world. One inherited rather than selected. Freedom, in this context, is not eliminated. It is bounded. Human societies often speak of freedom as the ability to choose between options, careers, beliefs, lifestyles, loyalties. These choices are real, but they occur within frameworks that determine which options exist, which are rewarded, and which are discouraged. The structure itself is rarely visible. It feels like background rather than boundary. If systems designed in deep antiquity still define those boundaries, then modern freedom operates inside ancient walls. Choice does not disappear under such systems. It is guided, incentivized, nudged. Certain paths feel sensible, others feel reckless, still others never appear at all. People choose, but they choose from menus they did not design. This does not require oppression in the dramatic sense. It requires normalization. When structures are inherited rather than imposed, they feel natural. Laws feel necessary. Hierarchies feel practical. Inequality feels unfortunate but unavoidable. These feelings are not innate. They are learned. The Anunnaki narratives describe a moment when humanity shifted from small adaptive groups to large managed societies. That shift required limits. Labour had to be organised. Surplus had to be controlled. Authority had to be centralised. Individual freedom had to yield to collective stability. Once that trade-off was accepted, it became foundational. Modern societies still operate on this trade-off. Stability is prioritised. Disruption is discouraged. Freedom is celebrated rhetorically but constrained structurally. This does not mean individuals are powerless. It means power operates at different levels. Freedom within systems is not the same as freedom to redesign systems. Most people experience the former. Very few encounter the latter. If the Anunnaki influence persists structurally, then freedom becomes a function of position. Those closer to decision-making centres experience more meaningful choice. Those farther away experience choice primarily as adaptation. This stratification is rarely discussed openly. Societies prefer to emphasise equal opportunity while accepting unequal outcome. This framing preserves legitimacy. Choice is framed as personal responsibility rather than structural possibility. People who succeed are praised. People who struggle are blamed. The system remains unquestioned. This logic aligns closely with ancient administrative thinking. Outcomes reflect alignment with order. Failure reflects deviation. The Anunnaki myths often portray disorder as dangerous. Chaos threatens survival. Order preserves life. This framing justifies limitation. Freedom that threatens order is treated as irresponsible. Over time, this association becomes internalized. People regulate themselves. They avoid choices that feel risky, not only materially but socially. Deviance carries cost. These costs are not always enforced by law. They're enforced by culture, reputation, access, belonging. Choice becomes a negotiation with consequence. If inherited systems still govern these consequences, then freedom is less about what one can do and more about what one can afford to risk. This dynamic shapes aspiration. People aim for stability, security, acceptance. Even creativity is often directed towards safe channels. Risk is tolerated when it serves the system. Innovation that increases productivity is rewarded. Innovation that challenges structure is marginalized. Freedom becomes instrumental. The Anunnaki legacy, interpreted structurally, would favor such an outcome. Systems designed to endure would discourage behaviors that threaten coherence. Freedom under such systems is not suppressed. It is shaped. People feel free because they are not coerced overtly. They make choices daily. Yet those choices rarely challenge the architecture of power. This creates a paradox. Individuals feel autonomous while collective direction remains fixed. Choice becomes personal. Consequence remains systemic. This arrangement is stable. It reduces conflict. It maintains productivity. It also limits transformation. If systems persist long enough, people forget alternatives ever existed. Historical memory shortens. Possibility narrows. The idea of freedom itself adapts. It shifts from self-determination to self-optimization. Freedom becomes the ability to succeed within the system rather than to alter it. This shift is subtle. It feels progressive. People are encouraged to improve themselves, learn skills, adapt, compete. These activities feel empowering. They also reinforce existing structures. Those who struggle are encouraged to adjust further. Those who succeed become examples. The system remains intact. If the Anunnaki never left in this structural sense, then freedom was never meant to be absolute. It was meant to be functional. Enough freedom to motivate participation, not enough to destabilize order. This balance is difficult to perceive from within. It feels like common sense. Choice also becomes fragmented. People focus on immediate decisions rather than systemic ones. What to buy, where to live, how to spend time. These choices occupy attention. Structural questions recede. Attention is a finite resource. Systems benefit when it is consumed by detail rather than direction. The Anunnaki myths emphasize knowledge asymmetry. Gods know more. Humans know enough to function. This asymmetry persists in modern systems. Experts understand frameworks. Lay people interact with outcomes. Choice without understanding is constrained choice. People can choose actions without understanding consequences fully. Systems exploit this gap. Contracts, terms, policies, algorithms. These shape outcomes while remaining opaque. Freedom becomes procedural. The sense of agency remains, but its scope is limited. This does not mean resistance is impossible. It means resistance requires awareness beyond individual choice. It requires collective understanding of structure. Such understanding is rare because it is not encouraged. Education focuses on participation, not redesign. History is taught as sequence rather than system. The Anunnaki narratives are rarely framed as system origin stories. They are framed as mythology. This framing distances their relevance, yet the patterns they encode persist. Freedom also depends on imagination. One must be able to imagine alternatives to pursue them. Systems that constrain imagination constrain freedom quietly. Media, education, and culture shape imagination. They present certain futures as realistic and others as unrealistic. Progress is framed within existing parameters. Radical alternatives are portrayed as dangerous or naive. This framing protects stability. If the Anunnaki legacy persists, it does so by narrowing the horizon of possibility without closing it entirely. People can move within the field. They rarely leave it. Choice exists. Direction does not. This arrangement creates a sense of responsibility without power. Individuals feel accountable for outcomes they did not design. This can lead to frustration, burnout, resignation. It can also lead to adaptation. People learn to navigate constraints skillfully. They find meaning within limits. Both responses stabilize the system. Freedom under such conditions becomes subjective. Some feel free because they align well. Others feel trapped. The system does not respond to feeling. It responds to function. If inherited structures shape freedom this way, then debates about control miss the point when they focus on rulers. The question is not who decides, but how decision-making is structured. The Anunnaki, if understood as system builders, would not need to restrict freedom directly. They would define the conditions under which freedom operates. Those conditions persist. This perspective reframes responsibility. Individuals are responsible for their actions, but not for the architecture that channels them. Change, therefore, requires more than personal choice. It requires collective reimagining of structure. Such reimagining is difficult when systems reward compliance and penalize disruption. This difficulty does not imply hopelessness, it implies inertia. Inertia can be overcome, but it requires awareness at scale. The persistence of Anunnaki-like narratives suggests that humans sense this inertia intuitively. They feel guided by forces older than themselves. Whether framed as gods, systems, or history, the experience is similar. Freedom exists, but it feels partial. Choice exists, but it feels constrained. This feeling is not proof of control by ancient beings. It is evidence of long-lived systems. If they never left, then freedom was never lost. It was defined long ago. As this examination continues, attention shifts towards signs of awareness, moments when individuals and societies glimpse structure, signals that suggest recognition rather than obedience, not rebellion but perception, because perception is where choice begins to expand. Awareness rarely arrives as revelation. It does not announce itself with clarity or certainty. It emerges gradually through inconsistencies, discomforts, and patterns that refuse to resolve. In systems designed to be self-maintaining, awareness is not encouraged, but neither can it be completely prevented. It appears in fragments, in moments when outcomes do not match explanations, in signals that suggest structure where randomness is promised. If control persists without visibility, then awareness becomes the only meaningful disruption. Not resistance, not rebellion, recognition. Throughout history, signs of such recognition appear quietly. They are rarely celebrated. Often they are dismissed, softened, or reabsorbed. But they recur with remarkable consistency. Periods of questioning, philosophical movements, social unease, sudden interest in origins. These are not accidents. They are responses to systems reaching cognitive saturation. When people begin to sense that the rules shaping their lives are older than justification, awareness begins to stir. Ancient texts preserve early versions of this discomfort. Even within Anunnaki narratives, there are moments of tension. Gods debate the burden of labor. Humans complain of exhaustion. Order produces stability, but also strain. These stories acknowledge limits. Control works, but at a cost. That acknowledgement is important. It suggests that awareness is not new. It has always accompanied structure. It is simply managed. In later cultures, this awareness takes different forms. Philosophers question authority without naming it directly. Mystics retreat inward, seeking freedom outside social systems. Reformers demand change while preserving order. Each response reflects partial recognition constrained by circumstance. Awareness does not arrive as total understanding. It arrives as misalignment. People feel that effort no longer yields proportional reward, that compliance no longer guarantees security, that progress no longer improves well-being. These feelings are often individualized. Stress, anxiety, burnout, disillusionment. Systems encourage this individualization. Personalize the problem. Optimize yourself. Adapt better. This response absorbs awareness by redirecting it inward. Yet signals persist. Economic instability exposes structural dependence. Technological disruption reveals fragility beneath efficiency. Environmental strain highlights extraction logic. Social fragmentation exposes inequality that narratives fail to justify. Each signal suggests design rather than accident. Awareness also surfaces through language. Phrases like system, machine, framework, invisible forces enter common use. People speak of being trapped, managed, optimized. These are not mythic terms, they are experiential. The language of control changes when belief fades but experience remains. Modern societies generate enormous amounts of information, yet understanding often decreases. Complexity overwhelms coherence. This is not simply overload, it is structural opacity. When systems grow too complex to be understood by participants, awareness shifts from comprehension to intuition. People may not understand how things work, but they sense constraint. This sensing is often dismissed as irrational, as paranoia, as nostalgia, as resistance to change. But recurring intuition across populations deserves attention. Awareness also emerges through historical comparison. When people study the past closely, patterns become visible. Hierarchies persist, resource concentration repeats, administrative logic remains stable, change appears cosmetic. This realization is unsettling because it undermines narratives of progress. It suggests continuity where novelty is promised. Education often avoids this discomfort by segmenting history. Ancient times are separated from modern systems. Myth is separated from governance. Belief is separated from structure. This segmentation obscures lineage. Those who cross these boundaries encounter resistance. They are accused of conflation, of overreach, of speculation. Boundaries protect systems by limiting perspective. Awareness threatens boundaries because it connects fragments. The Anunnaki narratives function as connective tissue. They sit at the intersection of myth, administration, and origin. They invite comparison across time. They suggest continuity. This is why they are treated carefully, allowed as mythology, dismissed as fantasy, rarely explored structurally. Awareness also appears through contradiction. Systems claim freedom while enforcing dependence. They promise choice while narrowing options. They celebrate individuality while standardizing behavior. These contradictions strain belief. People respond differently. Some retreat into denial, others into ideology, others into cynicism. A smaller number remain attentive. This attentiveness is not activism, it is observation. Observers notice feedback loops, incentives, behavioral shaping. They recognize that control operates through environment rather than command. This recognition does not require conspiracy thinking. It requires pattern recognition. Signals of awareness are often subtle. Increased interest in decentralization, distrust of institutions, desire for autonomy, nostalgia for perceived simplicity. These responses can be misdirected. Systems adapt by offering controlled alternatives, new platforms, new narratives, new forms of participation that preserve structure. Awareness is channeled rather than eliminated. The Anunnaki myths include warnings about knowledge. Too much understanding disrupts order. Revelation leads to consequence. This framing persists. Whistleblowers face punishment. Transparency meets resistance. Complexity is defended. Awareness threatens predictability. Systems designed to endure favor predictability over insight. This creates tension. Awareness spreads slowly, unevenly, often without articulation. People feel something is wrong but cannot name it. This unnamed awareness manifests as fatigue, disengagement, withdrawal, or heightened anxiety. Systems respond with management, wellness programs, optimization strategies, distraction. These responses treat symptoms rather than causes, yet awareness continues to accumulate. Technology accelerates this accumulation by exposing patterns. Data reveals inequality, networks reveal coordination, archives reveal continuity. At the same time, technology fragments attention, preventing synthesis. Awareness requires integration. Those who attempt integration face isolation. They struggle to communicate insights without triggering defensiveness. Language becomes a barrier. The Anunnaki narrative provides a symbolic language for integration. It allows discussion of structure without naming modern institutions directly. It offers distance, abstraction. This abstraction makes the conversation safer, but abstraction also risks detachment. Awareness without application becomes contemplation. Systems tolerate contemplation. What systems resist is collective recognition that structure is inherited and therefore changeable. Awareness becomes meaningful when it shifts from personal discomfort to shared understanding. This shift is rare. It requires conditions, trust, communication, time. Systems often destabilize before awareness consolidates. History shows cycles. Awareness rises. Systems adapt or collapse. New systems emerge with similar logic. Continuity persists. The question of awareness is therefore not about awakening or enlightenment. It is about perception within constraint. People become aware of limits before they become aware of alternatives. Alternatives require imagination. Imagination is shaped by culture, media, education. When imagination is constrained, awareness becomes frustration rather than transformation. This frustration can be redirected, blame assigned, conflicts intensified. Systems exploit this redirection. The Anunnaki myths include conflicts among gods, disagreements, divisions. These stories externalize tension. They give shape to conflict without resolving it. Modern systems replicate this by encouraging division within boundaries, political polarization, cultural conflict, identity disputes. These conflicts absorb awareness. Attention is diverted from structure to surface. Signals continue beneath noise. Environmental limits signal extraction logic. Economic precarity signals concentration. Mental health crises signal misalignment between system demands and human capacity. These are not isolated issues. They are systemic signals. Awareness arises when connections are made, noticing that different crises share a root, that solutions offered address symptoms, that reforms preserve structure. This noticing does not lead immediately to action. It leads to pause. Pause is dangerous for systems built on momentum. Momentum prevents reflection. The Anunnaki legacy, understood structurally, would favour momentum, continuous activity, production, management. Pause introduces possibility. This is why modern life minimises pause. Schedules, notifications, obligations. Awareness requires time. When time slows, questions surface. People ask why systems operate as they do, why alternatives are dismissed, why inequality persists despite abundance. These questions are often framed as impractical. Practicality is defined by system needs. Awareness challenges that definition. The question is not whether awareness exists. It does. The question is whether it accumulates enough to alter structure. History suggests it rarely does in time. More often, systems reach limits. Collapse occurs. New structures emerge carrying similar logic. The Anunnaki myths end not with liberation, but with cycles, floods, reordering, restart. This cyclical view aligns with systemic persistence. Awareness may influence adaptation, but rarely redesign. Yet awareness still matters. It shapes experience. It informs choices. It allows individuals to navigate constraints consciously rather than blindly. This is not freedom in the absolute sense. It is clarity. Clarity reduces internal conflict. It allows alignment with values rather than expectations. Systems tolerate this at individual scale. They struggle with it collectively. The signs and signals of awareness therefore remain scattered. In art, in philosophy, in quiet conversations, in personal decisions, they do not announce themselves. They do not form movements easily. They persist as undercurrents. If the Anunnaki never left, then awareness has always existed alongside control. It has been managed, redirected, and diluted. Yet it persists because systems cannot eliminate perception entirely. Perception is human. The question of awareness is therefore not whether people see, but how long they can look before distraction returns. As this examination approaches its final movement, attention turns away from analysis and toward reflection, not resolution, not conclusion, but a quiet consideration of what it means to live within structures older than memory, and whether understanding them changes anything at all. As the day settles and the noise of the world begins to thin, there is a particular kind of quiet that arrives only when nothing more is required. No decisions need to be made, no positions defended, no explanations offered. In that quiet, thoughts loosen their grip, and ideas that felt heavy earlier drift into a softer shape. This is where reflection belongs, not as argument or conclusion, but as presence. The question of who truly holds the world does not demand an answer to function. It lingers without resolution because resolution would imply authority, and authority has been the subject all along. Instead, what remains is an awareness of layers, of depth beneath surface motion, of systems moving steadily while individuals pass briefly through them. Throughout human history, power has rarely announced itself honestly. It has preferred symbols, stories, procedures, and habits. It has worn the language of necessity, safety, progress, and order. It has shifted forms without shifting purpose. Kings gave way to institutions. Temples gave way to offices. Gods gave way to systems. Yet the underlying logic endured. If the Anunnaki never truly left, then they did not need to. Their relevance would not depend on presence, but on persistence, not on command, but on continuity. What mattered was not who ruled, but how ruling was defined. That definition has survived intact through eras that believed themselves revolutionary. The modern world often presents itself as unprecedented. Technology advances, information spreads, borders blur. Yet beneath this motion, the same organising principles remain in place. Authority flows downward, resources concentrate, labour is managed, compliance is rewarded, disruption is contained. These are not accidents of modernity, they are refinements of ancient design. To live within such systems is not a failure, it is a condition. Humans did not choose the architectures they inherited, just as they did not choose the languages they speak or the gravity that holds them. Inheritance shapes possibility before intention appears. Freedom, within this context, becomes something quieter than rebellion. It becomes perception, the ability to notice constraints without mistaking them for nature, the ability to move deliberately rather than reactively. This does not dismantle systems, it changes experience. When people believe control is personal, they seek villains. When they believe it is abstract, they resign themselves. When they understand it as structural, they adjust their expectations. Understanding does not grant power, it grants clarity. The Anunnaki stories persist not because they provide answers, but because they preserve a memory of transition, a time when power became organised, when hierarchy became normal, when obedience became institutional. These stories mark the moment when humanity stepped fully into managed existence. Once that step was taken, there was no return to innocence. Every generation since has lived inside the result. This does not mean life is without meaning. Meaning arises regardless of structure. Relationships form, care persists, creativity emerges even under constraint. Systems can limit direction, but they cannot eliminate experience. What changes with awareness is the relationship to expectation. People often measure their lives against promises made by systems, security, prosperity, fulfillment. When those promises fall short, frustration follows. Awareness reframes this gap. It suggests that systems are not designed to fulfill individuals. They are designed to perpetuate themselves. This realization can be heavy, but it can also be relieving. It removes personal blame from structural outcomes. It allows people to stop internalizing failure that originates elsewhere. It clarifies that exhaustion is not always weakness, that struggle is not always misalignment, that dissatisfaction can be rational. The world is not broken. It is functioning as designed. Design does not imply malice. It implies priority. Order was prioritized. Stability was prioritized. Continuity was prioritized. These priorities shaped everything that followed. If ancient architects like the Anunnaki understood that civilizations collapse when systems are too rigid or too chaotic, then balance would have been their central concern. Enough freedom to function, enough control to endure. That balance remains visible today. People live lives that feel chosen, yet constrained. They participate willingly, yet feel pressure. They benefit, yet feel uneasy. This tension is not accidental, it is structural. As night settles, this understanding does not need to provoke alarm. There is no call to action here, no demand for awakening, no expectation of transformation. Those narratives belong to systems as much as compliance does. What remains is a quieter orientation, a gentle shift in how one holds the world rather than how one changes it. To recognize structure without seeking to dominate or escape it is a kind of calm. It allows space for rest. The Anunnaki, if they are anything at all in the present moment, are a reminder that systems precede individuals, that power rarely looks like power, that continuity is more influential than intention. They remind us that the world we inhabit was shaped long before our arrival and will continue long after our departure. This perspective can be unsettling, but it can also be grounding. It places individual worries in context. Deadlines soften, conflicts lose some urgency. The endless churn of demand becomes easier to observe without absorbing. Sleep becomes easier when the mind no longer believes it must solve the structure of the world before resting. The world will continue tonight exactly as it has before. Systems will operate. Processes will unfold. Decisions will be made somewhere, by someone, or by something abstract enough to feel like no one at all. And yet, within that vast machinery, individual moments still matter. Breath slows, muscles relax, consciousness drifts. Whatever holds the world tonight does not require vigilance from you. That, perhaps, is the quietest truth of all. The structures will remain, the questions will persist. Awareness will rise and fall across generations. For now, there is nothing to resolve. Only the gentle understanding that control is rarely where it appears, freedom is rarely where it is promised, and rest is allowed even inside systems that never sleep. The night does not demand clarity. It only asks that the mind loosen its grip and let the long story continue without supervision. And so, within that soft space between knowing and not needing to know, the world turns, systems hum quietly in the distance, and sleep arrives without asking who is in charge.